honored to be here. Thank you to Between the Covers, to the Public Library, and to our new friends at the Telluride Institute. I want to open this evening with kind of a gesture of friendship from our side of the San Juans, your side of the San Juans, and that is that we're very dedicated to not only the kind of ideas we're going to explore tonight, but how to turn those ideas into action, and how to write the new story we're going to talk about tonight, how to write that story onto the land, right? And as a gesture of friendship, I just want you to know that in our School of Environment and Sustainability, we have a Master in Environmental Management program. And the second year of that program requires each student to complete a 600-hour project to get something done for an organization anywhere in the world, right? And so we've had students, right now there's a student in Colombia, actually in a very, very dangerous project, doing sort of peace work down there. With students in Paraguay, we have a student who completed a project in Kenya, and then all over the Gunnison Valley, across the West, and across the United States. And so if you are associated with an environmental organization looking to get questions answered that are on the back burner, connect with us. If you are an organization or a landowner or an agency looking to get something done, connect with us. If you are someone looking to advance your own influence on communities and you're interested in a master's, you can do the master's from your environmental commitments here and then use those commitments here as your master's project for us. We put out about 35 to 40 of those projects per year. So just out of Little Gunnison, we're really trying to be a force for change and for practicing the kind of ideas we're going to talk about. And so we have some special friends here tonight from the Aspen International Mountain Foundation. Raise your hands, Eric and Carino. And along with our friends from the Telluride Institute, we have formed the Mountain Resilience Coalition that we'll be talking about at the end of the night tonight as a specific way in which we can put these ideas into practice and make some real on-the-ground change. Okay, so tonight I want to talk about a new story. I come to you with what I hope is an optimistic talk. And we are living in an age, right, in which sort of mad clowns are competing over who has a bigger nuclear button, right? And yes, it talks about wildness, and it is an era in which wilderness is very much under threat, right? With Trump's review of 27 national monuments, and we saw the reduction in bears' ears. We saw a tax bill that has tucked into it the reopening of Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is very much a serious moment for wilderness, but I don't want to spend all our time talking about that. Instead, I want to talk about the possibility of wildness as our news story, okay? We've been living out a series of stories that have brought violence to the land and to our species and our society. And you start to think about these stories and these narratives that we live out, right? You think of one of them, it goes way deep. For those of you who remember Daniel Quinn's old book, Ishmael, right? He calls it the taker story, the story that God made the world for humans and humans were made to rule it. Right? And that story has led to 7-point-whatever billion people, has led to a society in which 5% of the population consumes 25% of the resources, has led to our climate crisis. Right? These stories have failed us. God made the world for humans, humans were made to rule it, led to Puerto Rico becoming uninhabitable for 70,000 people. Right? We write these stories onto the land. The story of rain follows the plow. Right? Led us to a dust bowl that made a third of the continent uninhabitable when just half a century earlier it had 30 million buffalo and a prairie with 250 plant species per acre. These stories are so violent. The story of infinite growth on a finite planet. Right? Where is that leading us in terms of climate disturbance, resource collapse, exploitation of communities where those resources exist? And so it's time for a new story. We don't have a choice but to live out a new story. And my hope tonight is that we're going to learn that new story from the wildness of our places. Not just the wilderness of the land, but how humans shape places and how places shape humans to form a kind of wildness that I'm going to call the capacity for self-renewal. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a couple of things. One is, what's the difference between wilderness and wildness? Wilderness is very much a part of the wildness continuum that I will discuss tonight. And as we think about that distinction between wilderness and wildness, we're going to move down the continuum from wilderness to other kinds of places in which wildness and self-renewal emerges. We're going to talk about working landscapes, farms, ranches. We're going to talk briefly about suburban and then urban areas. Right? How do we find and fight for the wildness of these places, and how can that discovery of that wildness, that interaction with that wildness, that co-creation of that wildness help us discover the new story that we have no choice but to discover. Okay, so that's our night tonight, and then we're going to end with some of our friends who are here tonight are going to break you out in discussion groups to think about how do we get this done? How do we start enacting this story as a community? And I have colleagues from the Master in Environmental Management Program, Corey Knapp and Abel Chavez, raise your hands. They're going to be conducting a discussion of climate action. Corey is a climate adaptation specialist. Abel is a climate mitigation specialist. We have Jake Birchmore, local hero. What high school did you graduate from, Jake?
THS.
All right, pretty local. And Jake is part of a class this summer called Mountain Resilience. And when I talk about the story of renewal learned from the wildness of places, I'm going to argue tonight that that wildness is sourced in the mountains. And so Jake is going to convene a group of you who are interested in what are we going to be up to in the Himalayas of India this summer. Carino and Eric are going to, and John, Lifton, Zoline are going to be convening a group that wants to talk about what is this Mountain Resilience Coalition? And what does it mean that they are steering United Nations efforts to help mountain communities around the world build resilience? Right? And then finally, Dan Collins and Jeff Sellen will be talking about a grant they're working on to connect local high schools with sort of science education and communication about sense of place. So tonight we're going to go from the watershed all the way up to the UN in thinking about how do we build this kind of wildness in the mountain communities around the world, starting here, because those mountain communities are the source of wildness everywhere. Who's ready for that? It's a lot for one night. Right? Woohoo! Okay. And it sounded big, so we're going to break it down again, right? Wilderness versus wildness. Right? It's like Jeopardy. You can, I'll take wilderness versus wildness for 500, right? You got wilderness versus wildness, right? We have the continuum of wildness across different kinds of geographies, right? We have wildness as renewal, a new kind of renewal, and therefore that renewal is a new story, right? And then how to live out that story. Those are the categories tonight. My colleague Gavin Van Horn from the Center for Humans and Nature in Chicago, he and I put together this book called Wildness, Relations of People and Place. And what Gavin was really passionate about was how can we take the sort of fight for wilderness that's been very successful over the last 100 years and apply it to all places. Right? And so that'll be where we start on the continuum. And when you think about wilderness, what I will argue is that wilderness is an essential form of zoning on public land. Right? Just like you don't necessarily want a McDonald's right in your neighborhood. Right? We make choices on, at this point, 110 million acres of public lands, right, to keep industrialized activity and mechanized vehicles out in order to protect biodiversity, to have a scientific baseline for understanding climate change, and to have spaces for solitude and human transformation, and almost a spiritual level of connection. Right? And because those three values are so vital to us, we as a society in 1964 went ahead with the Wilderness Act, right? Which I think could never pass today. You think about a bill from Congress being signed by a president that defines certain landscapes as places where, quote, man is a visitor who does not remain. Right? And so we absolutely need wilderness zoning for these reasons. And so how do we find wildness in wilderness is an important aspect of this endeavor. And so I want to share with you a brief section here from Robert Michael Pyle. He's a conservation biologist, started his career in Gothic, Colorado, right, in the mountains, not too far from us, past Crested Butte. And here's what Bob Pyle has to say about the sort of continuum starting with wilderness. Conundrum Hot Springs bubbles out of a slice of alpine fairyland in Colorado's Maroon Bells Snowmass Wilderness area. This modest-sized hot spring, nested in the lap of high meadows thick with magneta, paintbrush, and Colorado blue columbines, is situated at 11,200 feet above sea level, a good stiff hike from any trailhead. When I got to know it in the mid-1970s, hiking from the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory at Gothic to Aspen, it was in good shape and never very crowded with the naked soakers who came to supplicate its powers. That changed with popularity as more weekend Cyberites made the long trek up from Aspen below. Notice he's blaming Aspen here. Internet images now show conundrums still pretty. Not entirely spoiled, but still sometimes bank to bank with bodies as if it were the Blue Lagoon in Iceland. The U.S. Forest Service has had to impose various controls on numbers and camping in order to protect the sensitive site. Conundrum Hot Springs is, relatively speaking, still wild, but it has grown less wild. Don't we have a project focused on Conundrum this next year, Corey? Is it Tyler's?
Tyler's.
Yeah, Tyler Lee, one of our grad students, will be focusing on how to assess permitting to reduce that impact. What do I mean by that? The words wild and wilderness have different connotations for different people. They can stand for anything you love, anything you don't understand but are trying to, or anything you long for, fear, resent, or rejoice in. They stand for any state you wish to elevate or derogate, praise or blame, inveigh against or agitate for. It would seem that these words can mean almost anything you want them to. Are they therefore useless as words? As ideals or as realities? I don't think so. But I believe we should take great pains to be clear when we discuss them, and even more so when we seek to apply them on the land. I wanted to open with that because it starts, in the Elk Mountains, not too far from the San Juans. And tonight we're going to talk about the mountains as our source of renewal. We're going to end with how can we fight for those mountains. And he's calling for us to make careful distinctions, right? So if wilderness is an essential form of zoning on public land for the sake of biodiversity, a climate baseline, and human spiritual transformation, right? And wilderness is that form of zoning. What is wildness? Well, wildness is in wilderness. Aldo Leopold called the wildness of a system or a being its capacity for self-renewal. So any community, any being, any system that can renew itself, Leopold would consider wild. And so when you think about the reintroduction of wolves 25 years ago in Yellowstone, right, how did that enhance the capacity of that place to renew itself? Right? You think about how wolves may have balanced elk and deer populations to reduce their grazing and not overgrazing the vegetation, which then stabilizes soil. So there's rich soil there to grow further vegetation to support further populations of species. That's a process of renewing itself. So wilderness clearly has that wildness. But I think there's a power to our relationship with things that renew themselves without us necessarily there. Now, we do have a role. Native Americans, the Bannock, by the way, were removed from Yellowstone unjustly in order to make Yellowstone look more like nature in 1872, right? More pleasing to the tourist. And they intricately and thoughtfully and intelligently, through traditional ecological knowledge and millennia of use and misuse and learning from mistakes and figuring out, they created the rich flora and fauna that Westerners found. And so we have to be careful not to say it's renewing itself as if there's not a human role there. We also made some intelligent decisions in reintroducing those wolves, and we're still learning from mistakes. I was reading in a recent article someone sent me that there's an elk herd, a giant elk herd, the largest near Yellowstone but outside of the park. They're trying to figure out in the last 6 months why that herd has disappeared, and they're now finding wolf carcasses with wolf teeth in them, right? And so we can't assume that this is perfect just because we've reintroduced wolves, right? Because we disrupted that predator-prey relationship that Native Americans had a role in that was there for so long. And so one of the things that, wilderness as land that can renew itself can help us think about is humility. Right? To what extent can we control through management? It's humbling to find those teeth marks, as passionate as I am about reintroduction. But there's also a humility that comes from being in those places. For those of you who have been above tree line during a lightning storm, right, you're reminded very quickly of the indifference of nature. But in that moment of recognizing indifference, you see a kind of deep beauty. And that combination of awe and fear is called the sublime, right? And that's where that sort of Western wilderness tradition comes from. And I think Bob Pyle ends his essay about the wildness of wilderness, the wildness of landscapes zoned to renew themselves where man as a visitor does not remain. I think he gets at the humility of our experience in those spaces really effectively. Here's what he says. On a recent trip to the Scottish Highlands, my friend and I came to a place called Borgie Glen. Standing there, gazing off into the high purple heather hills, we noticed a small sign pointing toward a dark forest of Scots pine, deep in a receding crease of the Cairngorms. The unknown, it read. And there I realized, that's what I most want out of this slippery word wild. I don't want to live in a world become so relative that the unknown itself is extinct. Right? With that loss of a relationship with the unknown, we lose a part of ourselves, our own wildness. Your own wildness and curiosity and innovation and creativity and problem solving that comes from moments of feeling lost. Right? And it's not that he's worried about just the loss of that land. He's also worried about the loss of that wild spark in us. And so moving down the continuum, and by the way, I do want to mention how incredible the success of Wilderness has been from a historical perspective. Right? 1913, John Muir loses his famous battle with Gifford Pinchot over Hetch Hetchy, whether or not to dam it to provide water and power to the city of San Francisco right after an earthquake caused all those fires, and they didn't have enough water, and the economy is expanding, and they need to irrigate the Central Valley where John Muir had an orchard, but let's not worry about that. And Muir, right, was so passionate about saying, no, this is a cathedral, right? It's like flooding a cathedral to dam Hetch Hetchy, and that failure, when it was finally dammed, historians will sometimes speculate it sort of broke his heart. He died a year later. And to say to him 100 years later that in a half a century, there will be a wilderness act that leads to a century from now, 110 million acres of wilderness, not counting roadless areas, not counting space outside of designated wilderness that has wilderness characteristics on BLM land, Forest Service land, national parks land, national monuments land. He would have called you crazy, And so we have to give ourselves permission to think on that level. If the impossible from a Muir perspective happened within a century, then what are we not thinking about right now about the future, not just of more acreage of wilderness, but the future of wildness everywhere? What are we not giving ourselves permission to dream about? And so as we move down the continuum, I'm going to ask you to join me in dreaming about what the future of wildness could be outside of wilderness land. Okay? Not that we shouldn't still fight tooth and nail for the acres we have and for more acreage, including migratory corridors between wilderness areas in the midst of the sixth great extinction. Right? But let's step outside of those designated areas and think about working landscapes. And so in the book here, we have a couple authors who think a lot about innovative approaches to holistic ranching. Joel Salatin, a very creative grazer from Virginia, and Courtney White, who started the Kimmerer Coalition. One of the great examples of unlikely partnerships in the West comes from the Kimmerer Coalition, where Courtney White has really gotten, he's no longer with them, but he really got ranchers and climate activists to work together because of Alan Savory's method of bunching livestock like wildlife herds and moving them around, mimicking those herds in a way that enhanced grasslands. And Savory's claim is one that's problematic. It's been criticized, but his claim is that just through that method, we restore enough grasslands around the world to sequester enough carbon and put a real dent in climate change. Right? And so you think about wildness as renewal, and it starts to get very interesting. Right? In the Yellowstone landscape, we talked about the renewal, right, of healthy deer and elk populations, which results in the renewal of stable soil and the renewal of healthy grasslands, right, from a wilderness perspective. But from a working landscape perspective, renewal as wildness gets very interesting, because suddenly it's not just about this method of holistic ranching enhancing and renewing the grasslands and therefore renewing habitat for species beyond cattle, renewal, but also it can become, and this is why ranchers show up at this conference with so much hope, becomes about the renewal of the capacity of a family to continue a way of life in a place. And you look at how hard it is to stay on a ranch in the West. What does it mean to be able to renew the ability of your granddaughter to be on the land that your grandmother and grandfather originally homesteaded? Renewal. That's a new kind of wildness. And we can become co-creators of that renewal through methods like this holistic ranching method that Courtney White and Joel Salatin talk about in the book. The same goes for working landscapes in terms of farms and renewal. There's an author in here named Devon Pena. He's from San Luis, Colorado. So now we're in the Sangre de Cristos. We've been in the Elk Mountains, we're in the San Juans, now we're wandering over to the Sangre de Cristos. And Pena, in his article for this book, talks about so many levels of renewal. Right, so as many of you know, San Luis is the oldest town in Colorado. Pena says it's the last town in Mexico, not the first town in Colorado. It's an acequia community. You know, most of you understand acequia communities. It's a commons, right? And the mountains around that ditch system, the acequia ditch system that irrigates water from the river into people's farms, relies on that mountain being a commons, relies on that mountain having a healthy forest, relies on that mountain having stable snowpack. So you have that water trickling through the rivers and the irrigation system, the acequias, throughout the year. And when Pena talks about wildness, he talks about all these layers of renewal. On one hand, you know, there's Culebra Peak. You know, the 14er you have to pay to climb. Remember that one? Culebra Peak. And that hovers above the town of San Luis. And Culebra Peak's snowpack is necessary because that snow melt, right, makes its way into the river, and the river flows into their ditch system. And the ditch system, the acequia system, is democratically managed. He calls it a water democracy. And that democratic management of that water, rather than first in use, first in right, as we have with Colorado water law. A friend of mine once called it the law of the 2-year-old. I had it first, you can't have it. Right? In this system, it's interesting because you have, you know, let's say this is the river. It's a long lot system in which everyone has land crossing the river. And that long lot means that everyone's got a little bit of subalpine forest up here in the ridge, right? Down into a little bit of, and so up there they can hunt and gather wood and medicinal plants, flowing into areas for grazing, down toward the bottom land that they can flood from the river for growing food, into a riparian area where they can graze cattle as well, but also they do have medicinal plants there, and they fish and things like that. And then everyone has that access to water, and it goes back out the other way. It's the same thing. And because these are narrow, long lots, if you want to rotate your crops, you better get along with your neighbor. If you want to graze your cattle and not overgraze your land, you better get along with your neighbor. And so it is a, I would call it a agricultural design that requires mutual aid and community-based ethics. Right? But it both relies on wilderness wildness. Culebra Peak better have healthy forest on it because in the 1990s when a logging company tried to clear-cut that, they found that that sped up the snowmelt, which threatened the food system of that water democracy. Right? Those ditches also expand the riparian ecosystem. And so here you have an example in which the reliance on a sort of wilderness-based wildness is rooted in a community that through producing their livelihood co-creates the extension of wildness. The riparian ecosystem being expanded through sustaining their water democracy and their food system as a community. Right? And so Pena says that in his example, humans become a keystone species. You know, in the way that a prairie dog is a keystone species, in creating that prairie dog hole, suddenly there's habitat for small rodents, and then you have prey for coyotes and red-tailed hawks. And he says, humans, when we think through and learn from our place in the right way, we don't just co-create wildness, we become a keystone species. And so what would it mean? This is giving ourselves permission to envision the future of wildness. What would it mean to return to being a people that produces biodiversity through producing our society? And his argument is that's what's happening in San Luis. So I want to share with you a brief video of Dr. Pena. And someone minimized my, there we go. If you go on humansandnature.org/wildness, there's a website for the book that has free films that my colleague Jack Lucido from Western's film department, and Gavin and I made. And I just want to share a little bit from Pena's. There's about 9 of these 10-minute snapshots of the authors.
The Acequia community is based on the sustainable and resilient use of snowpack spring runoff from the high mountains that we have here. It's a water democracy based on one irrigator, one vote. It's recognized as a highly sustainable way of life for arid lands, creating a diverse array of wildlife habitat while fulfilling the needs of the farmers to feed their row crops and our field crops. And it is an institution of self-governance. Many people have called it a water democracy because of the principle of one person, one vote. And the requirement of shared scarcity, so that everyone uses less in times of drought. And finally, it's also governed by the principles of cooperative labor. All of us participate in the annual spring ditch cleaning. It's a beautiful ceremony using local food as part of our lengthy lunch break between the hard work of clearing the ditch to prepare for the season's irrigation. When I think about how an acequia assumes its form and function, I think of it as an extension of wildness. It reproduces the biodiversity hotspots of the creeks and the rivers, so it mimics, it imitates the riparian zone that occurs here in the upper Sonoran Desert country. And so acequias extend the wildness of the mountains, the wildness of the canyons, by providing habitat to the very same species that populate our watershed all the way up to tundra. And so you will find hummingbirds at timberline visiting us all the way down here, where they will feed off our hummingbird feeders, and the immense profusion of flowers that grow in our fields and our milpas, our cornfields, mixed with heirloom corn and bean and squash, a floral bounty that drives those hummers pretty happy. So I would say the acequia is an embodiment of wildness, and it really involves...
I'm just going to fast forward to the end. You can see his argument of sort of like his water democracy, his place-based sort of, bioregional water democracy, as he says, extends the wildness of the alpine region all the way through the system.
Deeply rooted way of life, a place-based life, an indigenous way of life that obeys the original instructions handed down by the watershed. When I think about the acequia institution, I always think, what will this do for the hummingbird? Will the hummer find habitat there, friendly flowers, a little shade, maybe some old growth willow nurtured by our irrigation network that provides respite and habitat and food? And sure enough, those hummingbirds come back year in and year out, some of them migrating from as far south as Chiapas and even further south to create what I call the hummingbird headwaters. And the beauty of the hummingbird headwaters is this idea of unpossessive presence, of being able to inhabit a place without dominating it, always aware that every single act that we undertake as people will have multiple effects across the ecosystem. But it's not enough to be aware of our obligations to take care of place. And indeed, what the hummingbird teaches me is a very basic idea that when we talk about human rights or animal rights, the only one that really matters is the right to live in peace in your home. And that matters for hummingbirds and for people alike. When we follow this idea of the human community as the keystone species, when we're at our best irrigating like beavers, we are indeed exhibiting the high moral value of wildness.
when he breaks wildness down, whether it's hummingbirds or humans living anywhere, the right to live in peace in your home. That's renewal. That's that capacity for self-renewal. And to me, wildness is when we bring together, right, social, ecological, and spiritual renewal. When those three form a mutually reinforcing relationship, right? Ecological renewal is that forest not being clear-cut. Social renewal is a continuation of that annual ditch cleaning. Spiritual renewal, right, is eating the foods of your ancestors and passing that on to your children. And continuing, again, to renew the capacity to continue a way of life in a place. Wildness as renewal. And if that we can become co-creators of that wildness. Right? One important challenge, though, is to say, well, wait a minute, John. He's talking about a sort of remaining Hispanos indigenous community. What do we do about the fact of a planet that's over 50% urban now, driven by a global capitalist growth economy, with 7-something billion people and serious climate disturbance? Is it naive to suggest that we can come to produce our society in a way that co-creates biodiversity? That's the vision, but are the tactics driving that vision, even possible? And I don't know the answer to that, but I will say that, one of the authors in this book, Wes Jackson, gives us a glimmer of hope into an industrial level co-creation of wildness. Wes Jackson runs the Land Institute in Kansas, and his goal is to restore the function of the prairie. And he's very honest. He says, we're not going to restore the prairie. We're not going to lift up fences and have, plains-based Native American tribes following 30 to 50 million buffalo around, enhancing 250 plant species per acre with deep roots, but we can restore the function of the prairie. So, okay, Wes, what's the function of the prairie? Right? And he says, well, the prairie is to provide habitat, to sequester carbon, to enhance biodiversity, to stabilize soil, right? And therefore water, quantity and quality. And so he's developed a system of agriculture called perennial polyculture. And it's both edible, food for, his vision is the masses, but also fuel, biofuel. And he has 3 plants. He's figured out the perennial part with 3 plants. So you're not constantly tilling the soil, destabilizing the soil, right? You're not constantly, applying, fertilizer and pesticides and things like that. And so he says you can reduce fossil fuel use, and you can move more gently on the land. Iowa lost half its topsoil in its first century. That's clearly not a sustainable situation. So he wants to immediately restore the function of the prairie. So he has like one's called kerns, which is kind of like a wheat. There's like a sorghum and then like a sunflower type plant. His next mission is to make it polycultural, where different perennial plants that restore the function of the prairie are working off each other to control pests and fertilize the soil. And so talk about a system that would renew itself. And talking with his main scientist, Stan Cox, he says, they're 30 years out from that. And but on the perennial side, people keep saying, sell it, it's a miracle crop. And Wes says, no, this is not about a miracle crop. This is about a new ecological consciousness of our place within a biodiverse system and our niche within that system as co-creators of that ecological diversity, right? And so, when challenged about that, I kind of bring up Wes and say that he has is sort of a drive to feed a more mass-scale economy with this. And so Warren Buffett's son, Peter Buffett's given him $50 million to sort of get scientists around the world working on this. He has scientists in China and Russia, Georgia, Africa. It's pretty exciting. I want to share a piece about Wes Jackson and about this possibility of food-based co-creation of wildness, but I'm going to torture you a little bit because it opens with a description of a powder day. And I know you have not had a lot of those. And in this story, it's written by me, and I met with the wilderness historian Roderick Frazier Nash that day, and he and I had a friendly debate over the importance of wilderness, and his argument, and his side of the argument is that we should cohabitate with wilderness, meaning, and from Rod's point of view, we can't be trusted. He likes to quote E.O. Wilson, who says, Darwin's dice rolled badly for the earth, meaning, right, Darwin's dice led to these and this, and that led to ecological collapse, right? So Darwin's dice rolled badly for the earth, meaning us, And so he wants an island civilization in which, he says, 1,000 years from now, we'll figure out how to provide our food and water and energy so efficiently that we can live in these small little pocket civilizations and the whole rest of the planet can be wilderness. And my response to him is like, wilderness is essential for all the reasons I talked about tonight, but more acres of wilderness I don't think is our best idea for 1,000 years from now. I think we're capable of a bigger idea. So Rod says we need to cohabitate, wilderness there, us here. I say we can eventually get to a place of sort of inhabiting. And I don't mean us entering into current protected wilderness areas, but I do mean figuring out how to co-create wildness everywhere else. So this introduces you to our conversation that we had about Wes Jackson. Right here, I'm going to torture you. I warned you, okay? There's going to be wailing and gnashing of teeth at the mention of fresh snow. I finished the bus ride and ski one of my favorite stashes of fresh powder on a trail called Morning Glory. The snow is deep yet light in the steep trees behind the spot where my daughter Adelia and I stood yesterday. Knowing this is one of Rod's favorite trails, I look for ski tracks to see if he's been here today. All signs of skiers from weeks past are erased by blankets of fresh snow. Powder days tap into a deep cultural mythos, not unlike the unreal lure of pristine land. Skiing in the first turns after a storm summons primordial feelings of being the first human on Earth. And I experience this anew, dropping into snow up to my waist, with each turn feeling as if I'm walking down clouds. I ski to the lodge. My thawing fingers tap my thoughts into the phone, replying to Rod. I like your term cohabitation a lot, Rod, as a tactic for protecting current wilderness areas. Keeping us separate can't be trusted yet. But what does that look like as a global strategy for the future wilderness of the planet? Future wildness of the planet. One post-industrial example that fits my terms of co-inhabitation and co-creation through shared self-will is Wes Jackson's work at the Land Institute in Kansas. As you likely know, he is developing a perennial polyculture that restores the prairie's self-organizing ecological function, its wildness, while providing food and fuel on a major scale. He believes this new food system by end of century will require and cause a revolution of ecological consciousness beyond its accomplishments of reducing soil erosion, pesticides, carbon emissions, etc. The potential is there for a co-creative partnership that could result in more self-will for the land, more self-renewal for the land, rather than a new version of control. The prairie's long collapsed self-organizing function could be re-enlivened by our intelligent production of our food and fuel. When I check my phone after a few more runs, I find this reply from Rod. I like a lot of what Mr. Jackson is doing. As you know, my essay, Island Civilization, looks 1,000 years out to a way of inhabiting Earth that does not depend on agriculture and grazing as we now know it. By then, we could fabricate our complete needs in the islands and really share the now largely self-willed in 3015 planet with other species. I'm looking to a future in which nature does not provide our food and fuel. We do it with a high but benign technology. Until then, I'm thinking even Mr. Jackson's good idea deprives nature of its will and involves a degree of control that constitutes a form of slavery. Mr. Jackson's a gardener and not a guardian. And so in that debate with Rod, we sort of get this. He said this to a class of mine after the book came out. He said, he believes that humans are just 1 inch above devils, and I believe humans are just 1 inch below angels, right? And it really comes down to that. This question of can we be trusted? If wildness is the capacity of a system to renew itself, and we find it with the reintroduction of wolves on wilderness land, there's wildness there, and we find it, right, with the enhancement of grasslands through holistic management, and we find it, in a Sakia system or in a vision for restoring the function of the prairie that provides food and fuel of life that they're given. That's our wildness. But can we be trusted to figure it out? Right? Can we be trusted given our history in the West? And when I say our, I have to be careful, right? Because I come from a privileged position, white middle-class male from a society that's been imperialistic around the world. And so when I say we, I'm talking about that privileged social positions level of power in the world, how to figure out how to renew the capacity of self-renewal of all places through renewing our society? How do you rebuild your livelihood in a way that sparks enhanced biodiversity? That's going to take a lot of experimentation and a lot of failure, and do we have the space to fail, is what Rod's saying. The final stop on our continuum would be an urban landscape. Where might we find wildness? Where might we find this sort of capacity for a social and ecological system to renew itself, right? And we have a very compelling essay from a man named Michael Howard. And Michael Howard is writing from his home in the south side of Chicago. He's a black man who grew up in that community. It's one of the most violent neighborhoods in Chicago. And when he was about 15 years ago, he saw a report that his neighborhood had the third worst lead-contaminated soil in the United States. And it had a toxic dump on top of that, where a lot of gang violence was happening, and he decided to do something about it. And so he fought the city to restore that soil. He had gang shooting at his house as he cleaned up that toxic waste dump, and then fought the city to get them to clean it up and reclaim it appropriately. He earned an NSF grant to restore prairie, the landscape that would have been there before the city, on those 2 acres. Right? And then that prairie flowed into a forest that reflected the sort of pre-settlement species, and that forest flows into a working farm. Right? And I want to show you a clip from Michael Howard, because his essay is very powerful in thinking about renewal. So yes, do you now see coyotes and red-tailed hawks on that piece of land? Yes. So we have this example of renewal of a prairie system, renewal of flora and fauna of a prairie system in that place. But I think for him, renewal goes so much deeper when it comes to the social and spiritual level of wildness as renewal. So I just want to share with you a brief clip from him. And in it, he's going to open by saying, I think the fear. And I apologize for the audio. Right above Eden Place, by the way, is the name of this land that he's transformed. Right above Eden Place is an 8-lane Chicago highway and a train, and it just rained. And so cars going by on a wet road. And so we had to do some funky things with the microphones. The audio is not great. But it's important to think about, for Michael, as hard as it was to take on his city, as hard as it was to confront gang violence, as hard as it was to get NSF scientists to fund an African-American community member, not part of the scientific community, the hardest part of his work is getting his neighbors to confront a level of historical trauma that goes back to slavery. And that's where renewal goes deep. Okay? And that's where the possibility of renewing ecosystems opens up the possibility of renewing our social and spiritual capacity to heal from the land rather than to be traumatized by the land.
Fear, but they're better prepared and they can better learn how to quickly enjoy that diversity and wildness. In regards to the fear that we have to deal with here at Eden Place, specifically with the African American residents in Fuller Park and Brownsville, a lot of the fear goes back historically in regards to why a lot of people don't want to go to the woods. They don't want to go camping. They don't want to go out to the forest or the forest preserves, because it goes back to our history with those areas. African Americans for many years, were lynched in America. And so African Americans, especially prior to the baby boomers, and even the baby boomers had experience with lynching, when they see a tree, it's not a positive reinforcement for them. The fear goes deep because even before the lynching was popular in America, there was atrocities that took place in woods. If you wanted to get rid of the body, you just take them out in the swamp, and you kill them. And then if you were trying to escape, you had to go through the swamp, which was a horrific journey for a lot of people trying to escape slavery And so if you had to go through these swamps and these bayous of the south and these bug-infested forests trying to make it north, the last thing you wanted to see was another swamp, another forest, and you ingrain that fear in your children. It's like kids when they see a spider and they jump. That's a learned fear. And so the fear of the woods and the trees is a learned fear from the grandparents and the great-grandparents that transferred that fear onto their children. It's like, baby, we don't go to the woods. Baby, we don't hang out in no trees. You know, we're going to go somewhere we want some open grass where we can see. And so learn fear, ingrained generational, is a hard thing that we have to battle here. But I'm going to tell you, that's why we use fun so much here. That's why we try to engage them in activities in the outdoors that they will say, oh, okay, I'll try it, you know, and then we will act like we're not paying any attention, but we're very carefully trying to make sure that experience for that family or for that child or for that adult is a positive one. Eden Place Farm Project, it has had some challenges. Getting people to work land, again, has been an uphill battle. The first thing out of their mouth, oh, no. We don't do that slave labor no more. Because learned connotation and historical, I mean, we worked 300 years for free on the land. You know, who wants to do that again? But there are benefits that we can take advantage of today.
So, you know, it's so compelling, you know, what he's saying. And, you know, I think about my journey, which I'll read about at the very end, briefly, you know, west. And it was that, you know, from a place of privilege, the forest, you know, was transformative to me. You know, and so I think through Michael's story and the story of his community he's telling here, and it's like, I have to reckon with the fact that the spaces of transformation for me are triggers of trauma for fellow human beings, you know. And so when we think about wildness, we don't just have to ask, where is wildness, as I've been doing tonight. We have to ask, for whom is wildness? There's an author in here named Enrique Salmon. He's a Tarahumaran indigenous from Mexico. Anybody been to Copper Canyon? It's an incredible place. And he opens with the line, "There's no word for wild in my language." You know, he says, this is our homeland. He also uses the phrase keystone species. We're a keystone species. We co-created this place. Y'all showed up, called it wilderness, so you could say we didn't own it, so you could take it. Right? So the idea of wild for him is a tool of colonialism. And so one of our graduate students, Andres Esparza, did a study of Montrose Latino community and their connection with Black Canyon National Park, and found a very different view of what they wanted from that landscape, what would really make them feel welcome and transformed by that place. And if they wanted large areas for family picnics, and you know, I had a student once whose grandmother took her hiking every Sunday, and she finally asked why. And her grandmother told her a very haunting story that when the grandmother was 8, they were in a concentration camp, and she and her parents were being moved from one camp to the next. And the parents must have planned something, because they were crossing a steep forested slope, and when the guards looked away, the mother pushed this 8-year-old girl into the forest, and there were refugees waiting to take her in. They cared for her. Her parents didn't make it. She did. Moved to the United States, became a grandparent, and took my student hiking every Sunday because the forest meant something to her about justice and resilience and recovery and safety. You know, and so we have to respect the cultural diversity of wildness and think about and let underserved communities challenge what wildness is, for whom is wildness. And I won't be satisfied until I don't think we'll have social equity or justice until the places we call wild are equally transformative for everyone. It's a real important social barometer for us. And so when we get back to renewal, right? A lot of layers here. You know, renewal of that prairie renewal of some habitat for some urban coyotes. Chicago's coyote population is 3,000. There are camera traps that catch them waiting at stoplights at night. So there's that kind of renewal, but then there's the renewal of the spiritual renewal, of people's sense of connection to the land and the health that comes from that, and the healing from that trauma. And so there's your continuum of wildness, from wilderness through working landscapes into an urban setting, and across that continuum you find different layers of social, ecological, and spiritual renewal. And I think if we can bring together, a movement, a renewal movement that finds and fights for wildness everywhere, then suddenly you've brought together the working landscape movement, you've brought together the wilderness movement, you've brought together the environmental justice movement. They're sometimes divided together, and that's a pretty unstoppable movement. And we need a story that's going to bring us together. And that's how I want to end tonight, is, as promised, what is the new story? What is a new narrative for us to enact outside of rain falls to plow, God made the world for humans, humans were made to rule it, must have infinite growth on a finite planet. What is the new story? And I think it's a story that has to begin in the mountains. And Vandana Shiva is going to help us start that new story. She's an Indian physicist and philosopher and activist. She works passionately on behalf of Indian farmers, fighting against patenting of their seeds and the industrialization of their agricultural systems. And her main concern is that 250,000 Indian farmers have taken their lives in the last 20 years. That is the opposite of renewal. Right? And for her, she says a sort of paradoxical statement of development produces poverty. And what she means by that is in order to have a healthy society, you need natural capital. And in India, for farmers, right, it's manure, soil, sunshine, rain, glaciers. You need social capital, right? Networks of shared labor and knowledge systems across generations and communities to get things done, and you need financial capital. And the Green Revolution after World War II promised them, right? Fossil fuels and a tractor will replace your need for your neighbor, or your need to labor in the soil, right? That will be your social capital replaced by technology, and fossil fuels and fertilizer will replace your need to be in there with the manure, natural capital, and you'll get more financial capital. And they were left in debt, having relinquished their social, and suddenly you have neither social nor natural nor financial capital. That's the deepest form of poverty, where for some the best choice is suicide, for others is going to the slums of Delhi. And how is that a form of ecological, social, or spiritual renewal? And so she has a very hopeful vision for our new story that not only confronts this problem, but gives us a path forward, a story to enact that for her, like for us, begins in the mountains. When I talk about the infinite creative energy of the universe, I'm talking about Gaia's self-organizing energy, the creative human energy to work and to produce, to organize and to transform. In India and around the world, this human energy has helped cultivate the self-organizing energy, the wildness of the world. In particular, the creativity, innovation, and decision-making power of women, who still produce 80% of the world's food, has significantly driven the world's biodiversity. The majority of the 80,000 plant species that humans have cultivated have emerged from these self-organizing living energies of women. In other words, if we're going to redefine wildness, she says, if we're going to redefine wildness, we have to simultaneously redefine humans as co-creators of wealth with nature. That's our new story. We both rely on and co-create wildness when our living energies work with those of the earth. 14 miles beyond Gangotri is Galmukh. And Gangotri is a place in the Himalayas where the first trickles of the Ganges come from Galmukh Glacier. And there's a pilgrimage there every year. And I've been to Galmukh, and you can step over the Ganges, it's trickling out of the glacier. But it's receding significantly. I was there, and there was a lawyer from Chennai there who spoke English, and he came up to me, and he was upset, and I asked him if everything was okay. And he said, that glacier is sacred to us because it looks like a cow's snout. And the milky waters, right, are the mother's milk of that sacred cow. Right? And Lord Vishnu opened the sky Ganges, the Milky Way, when we didn't have enough water in our origins, opened it with his toe, and Lord Shiva, because Shivaling Peak is right there, Lord Shivaling cushioned the blow of that water. And that's why the glacier's there. And it doesn't look like a cow's snout anymore. And so this is the spiritual renewal I'm talking about, right? That is at the core of social and ecological renewal. Obviously is at risk of that glacier's receding, right? How do you have an Indian civilization without a Ganges society? How do you have Indian ecosystems? But also that spiritual crisis. And so 14 miles beyond Gangochi's Galmuk, a glacier formed like the snout of a cow that gives rise to the Ganges. The Galmuk Glacier, which is 24 kilometers in length and 6 to 8 kilometers in width, is receding at a rate of 5 meters per year. The receding glacier of the Ganges, the lifeline for millions of people in the Gangetic Plain, has serious consequences for the future of India. We need to generate and multiply the renewable energy of ecology and sharing, the renewable energy of solidarity and compassion, to counter the destructive energy of greed that is creating scarcity at every level, scarcity of work, scarcity of happiness, scarcity of security, scarcity of freedom, and even scarcity of the future. Either we can let the process of destruction, disintegration, and extermination continue unchallenged, or we can unleash our creative and wild energies to make systemic change and reclaim our future as a species, as part of the Earth family. And this is the story she wants us to return to, and it's not me coming up with it. There are peoples living around the world living out this story. We don't want to co-opt their story. We want to think about what are ways in which we, in our places, can add to, learn from, and share a story that goes beyond just the world made for us and us made to rule it. For me, personally, the mountains are that source of wildness. 15%, 13% of the world's people live in mountain communities. Mountain communities provide 25% of the world's biodiversity. 60 to 80% of the water we consume is sourced in mountain communities. Yet a third of mountain communities have food insecurity. And statistically, the world's most impoverished communities are in the mountains. And so, how do we look to the mountains not only as a place that needs our passion for building resilience there, but how do we also look to the way in which people are adapting in those places as the source of the future of wildness? Not just geographically, like you need those glaciers to have wildness everywhere, like yes, but also the wildness of new ideas for solving problems everywhere. So I want to briefly share with you just 2 paragraphs that get at my passion for mountains. And my passion for mountains is the source of, sort of my renewal, but also the source of the renewal of the places I've chosen to give my life to, the Rocky Mountain West. I'm returning from a trip to Minnesota where an Anishinaabe man who was wild ricing with me said, "I'm not Anishinaabe without wild rice in my stomach during the wild ricing moon in September. What's your rice? What's your version of that? Do I have something like that? Maybe it's like corn syrup." Yeah. But just being honest, right? Or fossil fuels. You really get to the depth of it. So here's what I had to say about his question a little while later. Returning to Colorado, I see the first snows blanketing the high mountains. My thoughts turn to winter, to cozy dark nights and crisp bright days spent skiing with my daughters. I think of my grandparents who retired early to a small trailer in New Hampshire so they could ski every day. I think of my mother, a special education teacher and single mother who worked a 6th and 7th day of each week as a ski instructor so my 4 siblings and I could ski for free. I think of my formative journey to Colorado 25 years ago in search of deeper snow. I think of skiing with my wife and 2 daughters every winter solstice to a 10 by 12 cabin, passing on to my daughters the art of the perfect carve through fresh snow. I think of their great-grandchildren and wonder if there will be a 7th generation of ski bums in my family. I'm aware of the climate change studies that show the surrounding Elk Mountains with perhaps 50% snowpack by the end of the century. I wonder what that will mean for how my family connects with these frozen headwaters every winter. Even more, I wonder what less snowpack and thus less water will mean for every ecological and human community living between my cabin and the Gulf of California at the end of the Colorado River. I know my rice. It is snowpack. And if that snowpack declines, If my generation does not act radically to mitigate, adapt to climate change, I worry that I will have failed as an ancestor. Yet regardless of the dire potential outcome of our apathy, acting now as if I already am a good ancestor, connecting my daughters with the power of snow while showing them and my students options for confronting climate change already enlivens a more resilient future for my descendants. Thank you. And so this is what tonight's about. You know, it's about how do we work together in a mountain community and between privileged and underserved mountain communities around the world to merge social, ecological, and spiritual renewal. You know, if we're being honest, that kind of renewal is sourced in mountains. And so we have an extra level of responsibility to build those social, ecological, and spiritual forms of renewal here and everywhere. And so we have a special treat for you tonight. If you're interested in supporting your awesome local bookstore, happy to sign books and chat one-on-one with you. I love being challenged about some of the ways I criticize Wilderness, but I'm also a fan of it. But the special treat is not that. But you will support the bookstore, I hope. You get like a penny per book, so it's really for them. We really want to talk with you about how to enact this new story, okay? And we are scaling up in a big way. I already told you about MEM projects to get things done in places around the world. You know, and so we have three master students here tonight. Can somebody hit the lights? Thank you. So we have Ethan, Stephanie, and Hedda. If you want to learn about this like place-based engine of change coming from a master's project, please join them in that corner. Okay. Scaling up to a larger view of this place, we have Dan and Jeff. Raise your hands, guys. Jeff's over here. So Jeff and Dan's right here. So they're going to be over in the Dan corner. And I'm not going to put words in Dan's mouth. He wrote this. They're working on a grant called SCAPE. The SCAPE approach to environmental education connects local water issues, pollution, water security, seasonal variability of flows, to system-wide knowledge, the Colorado and Columbia River basins. SCAPE provides opportunities to conduct field research, deepen students' understanding of digital tools, increase environmental literacy, and foster a sense of stewardship. So if you want to scale up from the place-based focused master's project to the level of the plateau, environmental education, you're going to hang out with these guys. You can scale up even more. And we have a course called Mountain Resilience from your local here. Jake Birchmore is going to be taking that with me and my wife this summer, going to the Himalayas. They're going to be installing a water system for women who are walking for wood all day, and for elders who are trying to walk to the hospital, and for children who are trying to get to school. They're going to work with local community members to build a water system there. They're developing a sister city between Gunnison and Majapahit, India, around shared mountain resilience efforts. And so if you're interested in how to support those students, or just dreaming with those students about what they could do there, Jake is going to be over there. And if you want to talk about the largest scale, how Aspen International Mountain Foundation, Telluride Institute, and School of ENVS at Western are working with the United Nations. We are in Rome together in December. And the United Nations Mountain Partnership brought together mountain activists and experts from 56 mountain nations to figure out how do we get the message of the mountains out to the world and work together to build solidarity for resilience in the world's mountains. If you want to think about how could your community influence the scale of the UN, right, in building mountain resilience, you're going to talk with Carino and Eric and John, and maybe they'll sneak you out into the hallway. Okay, so you suddenly feel like you're part of one of my classes. I'm breaking into groups. You're also a free agent. You can just go have a beer and say goodbye after supporting your local bookstore. But thank you again. And again, the future of wildness is merging social, ecological, and spiritual renewal through a new story of humans as co-creators of that wildness. So thank you.